When I was growing up, my sister Sarah insisted we needed to have a real tree every Christmas, even though our household budget was literally less than zero most months. She would go absolutely all out in making Christmas fun and exciting, even when we were kids, artfully decorating the house with handmade ornaments and cutting lawns all year so she could afford to make dozens of gingerbread cookies when December came around. My favorite childhood memories were pine-scented and trimmed in tinsel, ringing with my grandmother's awful singing voice, my sister's happy laughter, and the crackling of the fireplace. But the year I turned 11, my grandmother passed away a few weeks before Christmas. Sarah and I had adored Graham, and we both felt like we were totally unmoored without her. At 19, Sarah was practically still a kid herself, but she was dead set on keeping me out of the foster care mess she went through. When I was a baby, she had spent a few years moving between families before my grandmother finally got custody of us both. Sarah didn't like to talk about it, but I knew with absolute certainty how fierce her love was for me, and that she would throw herself in front of a train rather than lose me. Sarah was a wild teenager, and our grandmother was constantly chasing after her. Graham hadn't liked Sarah's boyfriend, Mark, at all. Before she passed, Graham had frequently tried to convince Sarah that she really shouldn't be dating a man 10 years her senior, and especially not someone with such a volatile temper. I didn't learn about this until Sarah told me when I was much older, because I had never known either of my parents. But my biological father had been like Mark. He had sucked my mother into a whirlpool of all the things that ruin a young woman's life before she even graduated high school. By the time I was 6 months old, my father and my mother had both passed from overdoses within a year of each other. I knew Graham was perpetually afraid that what happened to her daughter would happen to Sarah and me too. If it was possible, I liked Sarah's boyfriend even less than our grandmother did, with that kind of instant, unadulterated hate that kids have. I hated that he stole away my sister's time. I hated how he always smelled like cigarettes and cheap cologne, and I really hated all the times I had heard her crying on the phone with him. If Graham hadn't died, I think Sarah might have broken it off with Mark. He was an unsupportive asshole when she was sick, whining about how much time Sarah spent taking care of Graham and me, not even bothering to make sure Graham and I were out of earshot when he complained. But Graham had racked up so much medical debt from the cancer treatments that we lost our house only a few weeks after her funeral. So Sarah, Mark, and I were crammed together into a one-bedroom apartment, and my room was a tent of sheets hung with a clothesline and the living room couch for a bed. My sister scoured the classifieds for a second job and artfully dodged house visits from social services until we could afford something bigger. I spent every night rolling tiny balls of tissue to put into my ears, so I didn't hear her and Mark arguing about it through the thin walls, with him complaining about how he never signed up to take care of a fucking brat, and especially not two. I was less than thrilled about sharing my tiny space with a Christmas tree, but my sister was trying extra hard to make our first Christmas without Graham special. Mark had doubled her share of the rent because of me, and she had no savings to go to a proper tree lot. Mark made pretty good money in a union construction job, and I had heard her quietly begging him to just let her slide a little in December. But he was adamant that she had to cover all of her own expenses and mine, her beloved Christmas decorating being chief among them. A few beers in after work one day, Mark suggested we drive out into the local state park and cut down a tree ourselves. My sister protested that it wasn't safe, that we would get in a lot of trouble if we got caught, and although she didn't say it out loud to him, I saw her gaze kept darting to the quickly disappearing six-pack. He waved her off, and we reluctantly piled into his old Buick, me still in my pajamas with a hastily thrown-on winter coat because of the late hour. I remember that cold December night with crystalline clarity. There was a quiet crunch of frost beneath our boots, and my heart was pounding with worry that a police officer or park ranger might jump out from behind a tree trunk and catch us. My nose was running from the bitter cold, and I kept involuntarily sniffling, which annoyed Mark, who snapped at me every chance he got. Over the past weeks we had lived together, I got the impression that Mark hated me as much as I did him and was simultaneously obsessed with every little thing that I did. I would catch him staring at me in a way that made me want to talk to my sister, but I didn't know quite what to say, and I was petrified if he found out how much I disliked him, that he would throw us both to the curb. There was something incredibly unnerving about watching Mark walk around in the dark with a tree saw. I stayed as close as possible to my sister without knocking her over, my mittened hand clinging to hers tightly. Sarah squeezed my hand back just as hard, which made me wonder if she was equally as nervous about Mark's drunken laughter and uneven stride. We made our way deep into the forest, where no one would see us taking the tree down. The further out we went, the more the trees seemed to close in on us, as if they were banding together to intimidate us into going back. "How about this one?" Sarah had asked that question a few times before, her tone pleading, stopping in front of another tree. Mark blinked at her slowly and shook his head. It seemed as if he was turning this into a way to punish her for asking for something, as he so often did. Sarah clenched her free hand around a tree branch, looking at me worriedly. We walked until the moon hung high in the sky, wide and bright, like an eye watching us trek through the snow. My face went numb, my legs felt sore, and my eyes were heavy. I had fallen half asleep on my feet when Mark finally called out to Sarah and me, who'd been trailing behind him for the last mile or so. "Here it is!" His voice was full of feigned cheer. He pulled a flask from his pocket and raised it to us before taking a celebratory swig. His cheeks were red with exertion, and his eyes were glassy and wild. "It's a little tall for the apartment, isn't it?" Sarah's voice was weary. She dropped my hand and put her mittens on her own cheeks to warm them. We had stopped in a clearing where the moon seemed to spotlight the tree Mark had picked. I had to admit it was the prettiest one I had seen so far, a lush, deep green and almost perfectly symmetrical. When Sarah shined the flashlight on it, the yellow beam made the frost that covered it glitter, like it was already covered in golden tinsel. It stood about 1.5 feet higher than Mark. I tried to picture it in the small living room. "What do you think?" Mark's dark gaze was focused on me. The blade of the tree saw flickering sharply in the moonlight. I swallowed, feeling like a deer in the headlights, looking between him and my sister. Sarah saw the worry on my face. "We'll make it work. Thank you, Mark." She answered for me, reaching for my hand again. He nodded, having gotten the answer he had obviously been looking for, and bent down to start sawing. I had never seen a tree cut down before. When Graham, Sarah, and I had picked them out in the lots over the years, they had already been neatly trimmed and packaged. I felt a pang of sharp guilt in my gut, like when I first realized that the chicken fingers at the store came from the same kind of chickens I saw at the petting zoo. "Do trees know they're being cut down?" I asked unthinkingly, looking at the looming tree line that circled the clearing where we stood. I felt like they were looking at us cut down their friend. "That's the stupidest fucking question I've heard in a long time," Mark grunted, the saw making a screech that sounded especially loud in the silent forest. Sarah ignored him and knelt to look me in the eye. "No, kiddo, they don't feel it," she said reassuringly, pulling my knit hat snugly over my ears while making a silly face to lighten the mood. I couldn't help but smile and wrapped my arms around her in a warm hug. She returned the embrace almost too tightly. Over her shoulder, my gaze shifted to Mark. His face shone with sweat from the effort as he sawed diligently. Suddenly, something fell and bounced off his shoulder. Mark was startled by the impact, lifting an arm to block his face. I watched in horror as the saw blade ricocheted back, coming a hair's breadth away from his neck. I screamed, certain his throat would be slashed. Sarah whipped her neck around to see what had happened. Mark was staring at the half-sawed trunk, the blade still embedded and reverberating in the bark. Sarah leaped towards Mark to check on him, seeing the dangerous angle of the saw. The object that had hit him was just a pine cone. It rolled to a stop at my boot. I picked it up and examined it. "What the hell happened, Mark?" Sarah scanned the shadowed tree line anxiously, looking for what had caused the commotion. Her eyes landed on me, and I reflexively slid the pine cone into my pocket, like I might somehow get into trouble for holding it. "My hand slipped. No big deal," he said, trying to cover the fearful shaking in his voice. He got to his feet quickly and paced a few steps, taking deep breaths and another deep swig from his flask. "Should we just go home?" I heard Sarah ask him quietly. "No, we came all the way out here. Let's get your fucking tree." Mark snapped. He dropped to his knees and finished sawing through the tree, doubling his efforts in a fervor that seemed like angry retribution. Sarah led me out of the clearing to stand among the trees beyond, out of the area where the tree might fall. Mark kicked the tree to sever the last of the trunk, and it snapped with a sound like a gunshot, echoing through the trees and shaking the ground beneath us when it fell. Mark stood over it, panting like he had just won a battle. "All right," he said finally. "Come help me carry it." Mark held the base of the trunk. Sarah stood at the front, and I reluctantly made my way to the center between them. Even at 11, I recognized the uncomfortable feeling that I was helping to do something wrong, like dragging away a body. The tree was heavy, and I could barely see my feet in front of me. I tripped and almost fell hard on my face, and Mark swore, readjusting his footing with the extra weight. "Pay attention." He growled at me, his face red and shiny with exertion. My arms were exhausted, but I was worried about what he might do if I faltered again. I looked at Sarah, but her concentration was entirely on the looming darkness before us and keeping the flashlight trained ahead. Suddenly, I felt something wrap around my wrists. I almost dropped my arms again, frightened, but another glance at Mark reminded me what might happen if I did. It was a prickling sensation, like tight rubber bracelets, but it wasn't painful. I kept my hand steady and found it easier to keep up with the pace of the adults who stood on either side of me. I was so relieved when we made it to the car, I almost cried, my eyes welling up with tired tears. The prickling feeling around my wrists subsided when I freed my hands, and I scurried into the back seat, hugging myself to try to warm up and forget the strangeness of the night. I heard Mark and Sarah struggling to tie the tree to the top of the Buick, a scraping metallic sound that made me feel like I was inside of a can opener. The ride back to the apartment was quiet and tense. Everyone was exhausted, and we still had to drag the tree inside and up the stairs. It was later than I had ever been awake before, and my eyes kept drifting shut. I woke to Sarah's gentle hand on my shoulder, the apartment building looming behind her. It was built like an old wooden ship, with drafty hallways that barely kept out the cold, short ceilings, no elevator system, and 7 flights of stairs. The lights inside were barely functional and flickered eerily in the tiny alcove that passed as a lobby. As we assembled back in formation to pick up the tree, standing in the cold entryway, my mind was awash with strange images and feelings, like we had walked inside of the tree and gotten stuck, or maybe never left the forest and would be carrying the corpse of the tree forever in the cold darkness. Once again, my wrists prickled as we walked up the stairs that led to the apartment. This time, I could see Sarah's face more clearly and saw the strain that wrinkled her forehead and tightened her jaw. I didn't dare look back at Mark. When we finally entered, Sarah immediately pulled out the tree stand, measuring it against the trunk. She'd obviously been worried since she first raised her concerns with Mark, and her frown deepened. "It's going to be a tight fit," she said reluctantly. Mark, who had walked into the kitchen to take another beer from the fridge, slammed it down on the counter and grabbed the tree stand out of her hands. We had placed the tree horizontally on the threadbare living room carpet, and it occupied most of the room. Mark stood at the base of the tree trunk and started hammering it into the stand, using only his bare hands in fury. Sarah came and sat next to me on the couch that was also my bed, wrapping me up in my favorite old blanket, one that Graham had knitted for me, and of the few things I had left from our old life. She held me and kissed the top of my head as Mark let out a stream of curses. "There," he finally said, having semi-successfully shoved the tree into the metal ring. Both the wood and the metal had warped, and there were splinters and pine needles everywhere. He hoisted it up, and the top of it bent under the ceiling. Even standing, it took up most of the free space in the room. He looked at Sarah and me and grabbed the trunk, shaking it like a prize fish. Mark's eyes suddenly widened, and he cursed loudly, yanking his hand away from the tree with a sudden jerk. Blood oozed profusely between his fingers. He cradled his mangled hand against his chest, his face contorted in pain. Sarah hesitated for a minute, her reluctance palpable before she finally, begrudgingly, rose to assist him. Something in there bit me. His accusatory, bloodshot eyes found mine, almost as if he blamed me. I thought about the prickling pressure around my wrists and twisted my hands together nervously, feeling overtired and confused about what was real. Sarah gave the branches a half-hearted shake, obviously doubting his perception. "I think you probably cut yourself while we were carrying it, or maybe on some of the splinters." Sarah tried to soothe him as she pulled him towards the bathroom. He looked wildly between me, Sarah, and the tree, and seemed to realize how improbable his line of thought was, letting himself be pulled out of the living room. I was alone with the tree. Down the short hallway, I heard the familiar muffled sounds of Sarah's soothing murmurs and Mark's angry lamenting. I stared at the tree until my eyes grew too heavy to keep open, again struck by that odd feeling that I was still in the woods where we had found it. I slept fitfully, my dreams echoing the feelings that had haunted me while I was awake. I was back in the clearing, at the moment where the saw blade had almost hit Mark's neck. In the dream, however, black, gnarled tentacles that stretched like burnt branches emerged from the tree, holding the blade to Mark's throat, dark blood dripping down to the ground like thick sap. Along the edges of the tree line, more black tendrils crept through the shadows, slithering closer and closer. I woke up with a start, feeling a phantom rubbery pressure around my ankles. I was still sitting upright on the couch with my winter coat on, my blanket clenched in my hands. The tree seemed to take up my entire line of vision, and for a split second, I wondered if Mark had left me back in the forest and I had dreamed that I had made it back to the apartment. "Come and get your Pop-Tarts!" Sarah called softly from the kitchen, and relief washed over me. I walked carefully past the tree and took my breakfast from my sister, a warm bundle wrapped in a paper towel. Sarah looked tired, still in her sweatpants, and her thick curls pulled back into a messy bun, but her wide smile lit up her face as usual. "Mark's still asleep, and we slept through your bus, so we're going to borrow the Buick to get you to school. Can you go get ready super fast?" she asked. I nodded, my mouth full of artificial strawberry filling, and sped through my morning routine. Sarah had a thoughtful look on her face as we drove to school. "Do you like living with me and Mark?" she asked suddenly. I faced the window, letting my breath fog the glass. "I like living with you," I answered carefully, with a tact I now know was way too advanced for an 11-year-old to have mastered. I think Sarah knew that then. In the reflection of the window, I watched her knuckles turn white as she gripped the steering wheel. We drove the rest of the way in silence until she parked in front of the school. "I can't wait to decorate the tree with you tonight." She pulled me into a hug before I left. "Me too." In truth, I didn't really want to touch the tree again, but I hoped my smile looked real. That week at school was tough. It was always hard in the weeks before Christmas, as Graham was always just barely scraping by, and my gift wish lists were always just a few lines where other kids wrote pages. That year, I didn't want to write down anything in case Sarah saw it and felt badly she couldn't afford to get me anything. Instead, when the teacher passed out the paper, I drew the forest from my dream, putting extra detail into the tree, hoping to solidify that I was truly back in reality by capturing it on the page. When I got off the bus outside of the old apartment building after school, I knew something was wrong. Sarah always waited for me to walk me from the bus stop, using her break between her shifts at the diner down the road. That day, I walked up the stairs to the apartment by myself, crunching on the dried pine needles we had left behind while dragging the tree the night before, full of dread for what I would find. When I opened the door, the sight of the tree greeted me. A single strand of lights was wrapped around it, dangling like a tail, the rest lying in a tangle on the ground. Sarah sat in the same spot I had on the couch this morning, still in her pajamas instead of her work uniform, holding a bag of frozen peas against her chin. She saw me in the doorway and raised a hand in a wave, but her eyes were sad. I looked back at the tree, wondering if the strange magic it seemed to possess had gotten to her too.
"Ready to decorate?"
she asked, her voice muffled by the bag. I stared at her, letting my backpack and coat slide to the floor next to the couch. She held my gaze and then slowly took the bag of peas away from her mouth, sighing like I was making her tell a secret. Her chin was a violent shade of purple, and dried blood was crusted around her lips. I stared at her, and she seemed to shrink into herself. "I tripped while I was taking out the ornaments," she said quietly. One of her handmade paper snowflakes was in her lap, and she smoothed it out and handed it to me. "Where should this one go?" She changed the subject. I took the snowflake from her, reeling from the 100 questions I had that ran through my mind. In a fog of worry I couldn't name, I looked around the tiny apartment and blindly found a spot on the wall. We repeated that a few more times until the air finally got lighter. She put on a soundtrack of classic Christmas carols and joined me in putting up the ornaments and decorations, although she didn't sing like usual as her bruised mouth was still obviously painful. I was nervous about touching the tree at first, but quickly got used to the familiar motions of Christmas decorating, inwardly chiding myself for being childish and silly. I wanted to ask Sarah more about what happened, but she seemed as delicate as the ornaments we hung. When I filled the area where I could reach, Sarah hoisted me up under my arms, and we both started laughing uncontrollably. I felt my brow furrow as a branch seemed to bend towards me as if it wanted me to hang an ornament on it. A sudden icy blast froze us both in our tracks. Mark stood in the front doorway, smelling like cold air, cigarettes, and alcohol. He had a broad, unnatural smile plastered on his face. "Wow, this place looks great," he said cheerily. Sarah winced as he walked over to her. He kissed her roughly, ignoring her bruised chin. "I told you this was the right tree," Mark blustered, walking around it in a slow circle. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it looked a little silly in the small apartment, the top still bent over because it didn't fit. It looked like something wild we were trying and failing to domesticate. "Looks like you still need some help with the lights. Could you hand those to me?" Mark was directing his attention to me, which always gave me goosebumps. I looked to the ground next to my feet, picked up a strand from the tangled wires, and handed it to him. Mark took them from me and looked pointedly at Sarah. "See, that's what you do when you want something, Sarah. You ask nicely. You don't just take it." He tightly cinched the strand of lights around the branches, violence in his movements, like he was tying someone up. "I pay for the gas and the insurance, Mark! And you were asleep!" Sarah hissed, almost too quietly for me to hear. He shot her a warning look that chilled me to my toes, reaching his hand out to me for another strand. His other hand was bandaged, with blood seeping through the white cloth, and remembered his accusation of a creature in the tree the night before. I handed the strand of lights to him, feeling the urge to run away from the apartment and never come back. Mark withdrew his arm suddenly, dropping the lights. He shook it wildly and rushed to the bathroom. I heard running water from the sink. It was just like last night, but this time Sarah didn't follow him to help. How old are those shitty lights? I think they just shocked me. This fucking tree, I swear, Mark shouted back to us. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she looked at me, lightly touching her mottled chin. The rest of the night sped by in a blur. I was old enough that I had pieced together some of what happened, but young enough that I had no idea what to do about it. I was furious that Mark could just be so casually cruel, from hurting Sarah to casually watching TV in the bedroom after eating the dinner she made. The walls around us felt especially small and tight. There was no mention from anyone about finishing the decorating we had started earlier, the tension as thick and heavy as the air before a snowstorm. My heart was splintered, and I felt like I was trapped in a cage decorated for Christmas. As part of our nightly routine, Sarah sat with me to help me after dinner to help with my homework. I felt ashamed that I couldn't meet her eyes, but I couldn't look at her bruised face again, even when she tucked me in. While I was anxious and stressed, I was still exhausted from the night before, and I fell asleep almost immediately. This time, when I dreamed, I was still in the apartment, but it was filled with an infinite forest of pine trees. The roots choked the carpeted floor, and the branches rose through the ceiling. Strands of light slithered like snakes, weaving through the shadows. The Christmas tree stood in the center of it all, but it wasn't the same tree we had decorated earlier that night. It was illuminated like a star, covered in layers of lights and ornaments. There were glass baubles in such mass they looked like cauldrons bubbling over, tinsel that exploded in patterns like fireworks, hand-carved wooden figures, intricate paper flowers, candy canes, and dried fruits in all the colors of the rainbow, popcorn strands that hung in so many loops it looked like lace, enough bells to fill 1,000 sleds, and what seemed like a planetary ring of candles and electric lights in countless shapes and sizes. It was like 1,000 Christmases all happening at once. The air around the tree vibrated with energy, and the room seemed to expand and contract around it as if it were breathing, alive and conscious. In the dark space around the almost painful incandescence of the tree, a looming angular void slowly separated itself, taking corporeal form. It was drawing in the light around it, the effect reminding me of pictures I had seen of black holes in space. It was featureless, yet there was an undeniable sense of sentience in its fluid, deliberate movements. It suddenly stilled, as if it became aware of my gaze, a chilling moment of recognition in the darkness. As it leaned forward, my stomach dropped, an instinctive reaction to the unknown and potentially malevolent creature. But it seemed more curious than anything. It was bowing to me, or so it seemed, long, finger-like appendages outstretched, curling and uncurling towards me like winding smoke. Before I knew it, my own hand was lifting, almost of its own volition, extending towards the curling wisps. I felt something wrap around my arm and woke with a scream on my lips. Something clamped down over my mouth. Hey, honey, it's me!" It was Sarah's whispered voice. My chest heaved, and I was still caught somewhere in the blurry line between dream and reality. "You have to be quiet, okay?" The urgency in her voice brought me back more solidly into reality. She was kneeling over me on the couch. I noticed she had her coat on, the worn fur on the sleeve soft against my cheek. The room was dark and boxy again, lit only by the tree's few strands of Christmas lights. "We're going to leave tonight," Sarah continued, stroking my hair soothingly. "One of the girls at work told me about a place that will get us somewhere to stay. Just the two of us, somewhere safe. But Mark can't know we're leaving." She gestured beside her, and I saw she had brought me my backpack. I already have half of our things downstairs, so I just need you to pack up your homework and the stuff that you have out here. I have a taxi waiting for us, and I'm going to run down to let the driver know we're coming. I'll be right back, okay? She helped me into my winter coat. I nodded, feeling both tired and awash with adrenaline from my dream and our sudden escape. Sarah noticed my unease. Can you be super fast and super quiet? She squeezed my hands, trying to bring me to the present. I nodded again, this time with more certainty. Sarah still seemed uncertain about leaving me, her lips in a tight line and made more severe by the swollen bruise, but I knew she had to make sure the taxi wouldn't leave, and we couldn't afford to leave what few clothes and other items we had behind if we weren't coming back. She kissed the top of my head and grabbed the suitcases, quietly closing the front door behind her. I started packing, my hands fumbling in the dark, first my homework, my clothes, and then my blanket, squishing it down to fit. I surveyed the room, looking to see if I needed anything else, and then realized I had forgotten the most important things we had: Sarah's Christmas decorations. I pulled out my blanket, the decision to sacrifice it an easy one, when I knew how important our Christmas decorations were to Sarah. Graham would have understood. I laid it down in front of the tree and started stuffing as many of Sarah's ornaments and decorations as I could into the backpack. I picked them off the walls and the tree as quietly as possible, but in my half-awake state, I forgot that one ceramic bauble played the old carol, "O Christmas Tree," when you shook it. I stuffed it into my backpack quickly, but my hands shook as a tinny tune sang with ominous cheer in the darkness of the living room. After a minute that seemed like an eternity, I turned my head to survey the room. My stomach sank into my feet. There was a tall, shadowy figure standing in the doorway. I blinked a few times, wondering if the creature from my dreams had returned. But in the faint glow of the lights on the tree, I realized it was Mark. He stared at me, his eyes utterly black in the flickering red and green lights. In his hands, the blade of the tree saw glimmered. I wondered if he had come for me, Sarah, or for whatever he thought bit him the day before. He took a step forward, and my question was answered. I flinched back. My heart raced, and my stomach somersaulted, my mouth filling with bile like I might throw up. I couldn't remember how long ago Sarah had left, or how long it would take her to make her way back up the stairs. Mark took another step towards me. His face was a mask of fury, like all of the hatred he had built up over the months had distilled into this moment. Suddenly, like I had stumbled back into my dream, black, twisted appendages erupted from the tree. They solidified into jagged, branch-like tentacles, pulling Mark into an embrace and surrounding him like a feeding octopus. His face was a mask of shock, and he grabbed at his neck. His face was incredulous and disbelieving at first, then twisted with increasing panic as more appendages erupted from the tree, wrapping like coiling snakes around his arms and legs. The tree saw fell out of his limp hand. In only a few seconds, he was lifted off the ground entirely. As his body was pulled tighter into the tree, his skin seemed to melt away like it was being devoured by acid, the needles embedding themselves into his skin like stinging bees. Mark howled, the sound high-pitched and desperate, like an animal that knew it had been caught by a predator that would swallow it whole. The room filled with the foul smell of burnt pennies. Smoke began filling the air, then fire, starting at the tree's base and then slicing up, covering Mark's legs and torso. His screams were feral and panicked, and something else seemed to scream with him, echoing him in a tone that seemed almost mocking. The fire crept further up his neck, and then finally his face, his choked screams becoming wet with blood and quieter as life left his body. The entire tree was engulfed in flames, burning like a bonfire, the heat intense on my face even from across the room. I felt something pull hard at my shoulder, and I screamed with everything I had, my arms going up to fight off whatever had come for me. My eyes stung with smoke, but the room was filled with bright light now, and I recognized my sister. She pulled me into her arms, bolting across the living room and through the open front door. Over her shoulder, I saw one of those tentacles stretch high above the tree, moving back and forth, almost like it was waving me a farewell. Sarah tore down the stairs with me, held tightly in her arms, sprinting until we were in the safe embrace of the cold winter night. We clung to each other in the back seat of the taxi, smelling like soot and crying together. The taxi driver had seen the apartment window explode with flame and used his radio to call 911. The three of us waited for the fire department, the fire alarm howling mournfully as the other tenants sleepily and confusedly streamed out of the building. Sarah stroked the back of my hair and whispered soothing things into my ear about how much better our life would be at our new place and how everything would be easier from now on. She told me not to think about what I had seen, but I couldn't help it. The memory was soldered into my mind. I tried to explain the creature I had seen to Sarah and to the police officers and fire marshals who spoke to me in gentle tones throughout the week, but all it did was earn me pitying looks and a few sympathetic hugs. They ruled the fire and Mark's death as caused by faulty electrical wiring in the Christmas lights. His apartment was the only one that had been touched by the fire, burnt almost entirely down to the steel beams, a nearly perfect square carved from the rest of the old building. Sarah had been right when she spoke to me in the taxi. Our lives were so much better in the months that followed. She and I were able to stay together, living in a tiny, quaint townhouse that was funded by a local nonprofit that worked with domestic violence survivors. They made sure that Sarah and I were taken care of through that winter and in the years after, and I got more presents that Christmas than I had in my whole life. Later that year, in the spring, I went on a scouts trip to that same park we had taken the tree from. I slipped away from the tents in the middle of the night while the other campers slept and hiked for hours until I finally found the clearing where the tree had been. I had forgotten about the pine cone in my coat pocket until Sarah and I got to the hotel after the fire. After I realized what it was, I kept it safe, feeling like it was something significant. I planted it next to its stump in that clearing, burying it with the drawing I had made of the forest and marking the spot with a rock I had painted with the word "Thank you" and dotted with hearts and stars. I spent a few years caught up in being a teenager before I thought about the tree again, finally remembering it right after I got my first car in college. That summer, I drove back to that forest to check in, more out of a sense of closure than any expectation it had actually grown. When I got there, the tree had grown beautifully. It was a vibrant shade of green with a thick canopy of needles, and it reached higher than my waist. I gathered a small bouquet of wildflowers and placed them at its tiny trunk, leaving with a smile. After that summer, I went back there as often as I could, the act of visiting becoming a ritual that felt soothing and peaceful. I noticed that other hikers, maybe inspired by the growing altar I had created, had left offerings of their own painted stones, little notes and trinkets. We still take a trip out to the forest to visit the tree once every year. My family thinks it's a fun, unique holiday tradition that we have an outdoor Christmas tree. Sarah brings her family too, although I think it's more to support me and spend time with us than her belief in what I saw. I'm not sure, though. We've never spoken about it outright, but I know we switched to having a plastic tree every year after Mark's death, and she's never had a real tree inside her house since. Every Christmas break, we make a whole day of decorating. We still have everything I saved from that night, although some of the more delicate things stay in storage, but Sarah also has her own Etsy store now, so we have an unlimited supply of beautiful handmade ornaments. We sing carols and drink cocoa, and the kids play tag and build snowmen. The tree is still solid, strong, and healthy, and in the next couple of years, we'll probably need a professional ladder to get all the way up to the top. I don't know if whatever watched over me that night lives in the new tree. I haven't dreamed about it since then, although I've noticed the shadows around it never seem to sit quite as flat as they should. I like to think that it does. I like watching it stand tall and quiet in the peaceful winter air with all the other trees around it. I wonder if I was the first to lay down offerings at its trunk, or if I was just the most recent in a line of many that came before me. I wonder if it spreads itself wide down in its roots, looking for more evil things to eat. It brings me so much joy to watch it grow alongside my children and my sister's children, marking the years with happy memories. I like to think we make it happy too.